Welcome to Women's Space Vancouver May webinar. Thanks for joining us today. And before I introduce our three guests, I'll just say a few words about our organization for any of you who are new. Women's Space is a grassroots feminist group interested in protecting and reclaiming women's rights, including the right to retain spaces in organizations created for women. We stand for the protection of women's human rights, the protection of women-only spaces, including women's organizations, lesbian spaces, shelters for women fleeing male violence, rape crisis centers and institutions where women are incarcerated. We reject sex role stereotypes. We reserve the right to discuss and describe our bodies, our sexual lives, our health, reproduction. We acknowledge the intersections of race, class, and colonialism on our oppression. We demand the right to gather and express ourselves without bullying and intimidation. We stand for the protection of children and youth, and we support true democracy. And in our grassroots work, we lobby governments, media, and other organizations. We work on campaigns in solidarity with other groups in Canada and internationally. We participate in public political actions and protests, and we host online meetings and sessions like this one. So our session today is called Where We Are, What We Have, and What We Could Be, Prostitution, Laws in Canada. And we have three guests. We have Cherry Smiley, JANINE BENEDET, and TRISHA Baptie, who will each discuss different aspects of our topic today. So first, I'm going to introduce Cherry Smiley. Cherry is a decolonizing feminist from the Inuktitut and Diné nations. She's an irreverent yet award-winning artist, researcher, troublemaker, cat lover, probably has a couple cats sitting on her lap right now, and she's a #1 theme park fan. Cherry has a PhD in communication studies from Concordia and a Master's of Fine Arts from Simon Fraser University. She works with others in the women's liberation movement to end male violence against women and girls. And Cherry's going to talk about the research she did for her book, Not Sacred, Not Squaws, Indigenous Feminism Redefined, including what she witnessed while in New Zealand, where prostitution has been fully decriminalized since 2003, and how Indigenous and racialized women are treated within prostitution. So welcome, Cherry. Thanks so much for being here. And I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris. And thanks to Women's Space Vancouver for putting this together. It's a really important topic. So as Chris mentioned, I'm going to speak to you all a little bit about the process of doing my PhD research. So my research was initially, and hold on. Oh no, my thing is going off. Wait, sorry. Oh my gosh. So my initial question for my PhD research was asking how is the prostitution of Indigenous women and girls in Canada a form of colonization? Oh my God. And I'm so sorry. My thing is like having a problem. So that was where I started my research, and I think that's kind of what I've been looking at over the past 15 years or so. Was really focusing on Indigenous women and prostitution in Canada. And so that's where I began. And I think that, as I began to look at the issue and the connections, I think what I saw is, I think what a lot of us generally know now, as I would think at this point, which is that Indigenous women in Canada and Indigenous women in pretty much any country around the world are grossly overrepresented in prostitution. And so we know that because of different research that has been done over the years, which has really kind of definitively shown that is the case. And the actual representation of Indigenous women is likely much higher than we have recorded. And that's because in order to count these women, it's mostly women on the street that are being counted. So you also have Indigenous women who are in brothels, Indigenous women who are in their homes, Indigenous women who may be in and out of prostitution, Maybe they're in for a couple of months and then they're out and they're back, and so they're not counted. So the actual overrepresentation is likely much higher than we know. And we also know a lot of the really alarming statistics about Indigenous women in Canada, which is that we are subjected to very, very high rates of male violence, both in our homes, in our communities, and outside of our communities as well. Very high rates of disability, very high rates of poverty, addiction, we're number one in all of the categories that you don't want to be number one in: incarceration, institutionalization, all of these kinds of things. And so we know that these horrific statistics, that this has been the case since white men came to Canada back in the day. And when white men came to Canada back in the day, is when we saw the advent of prostitution in Canada. So in most Indigenous nations, or at least I haven't been able to find one in Canada that had a word for prostitution in their traditional language. What I've seen happen is languages were adapted to find a word or to find a description for prostitution, but that there was no actual word for that exchange of something, whether it be money or food, housing, whatever, for a sex act. The concept didn't exist. And there's many reasons why, and we'll talk about that in just a minute as to why that was the case. So when white men came to Canada, we began to see prostitution around early forts and military bases. Members of the Northwest Mounted Police, who preceded the RCMP, were demanding prostitution from Indigenous women and girls, Indian agents as well. And so at the time, Indigenous people, in particular Indigenous women, were confined to reservations. And so we're starved, we're denied what we needed to live. And so you'd see in many cases the Indian agent or Northwest Mounted Police men being like, hey, I'll give you this, X pieces of bread if you do this sex act in exchange. And so it began very, very quickly once white men arrived. And this relationship between prostitution and Indigenous women was so strong that the first prostitution legislation in Canada was actually embedded in the Indian Act. And it only applied to Indigenous people, but in reality, it only applied to Indigenous women. And the legislation was so overly broad that it was basically, if you were an Indigenous woman, you were seen as a prostitute in the eyes of government at that time. And what was important, I guess, about that legislation, and I know Janine and Trisha can talk more about this as well, is that especially when it started, it wasn't trying to stop prostitution. It was just trying to control where it happened and who was allowed to engage in it. And so, for example, you weren't allowed to have prostitution like in your native housing, whatever that might have been, like teepee or longhouse, whatever it was. So they would say it can happen here, but it can't happen there. These people can engage in it, these people cannot. So they definitely weren't trying to help women in prostitution at all at that point. And so given this history, we really do see how Indigenous women and prostitution are so intimately linked. But the question, I guess, as I was trying to answer, which was, how is the prostitution of Indigenous women and girls a form of colonization in Canada? I realized that I was starting a little bit too late in the discussion and I had to back up a little bit. And so I started to think about colonization and what it is and how we define it today in Canada. And so what I realized was that the definition of colonization that we have now was made up by men. and it conveniently leaves out sex as a factor in terms of colonization. So I began to wonder, what would a woman-centered definition of colonization look like? What would colonization look like if it was primarily sex-based as opposed to race-based? Um, and how does that change things? And so it's changed everything, really. And I think that a sex-based understanding of colonization really flips things on its head, and it provides us with answers that we couldn't previously answer. It provides us with solutions where there weren't before. And it really does hold men, and all men, whether that's Indigenous men or non-Indigenous men, accountable for their roles. Just as a quick example, we all know the case of Cindy Gladue, who was murdered by a man who had paid her for sex acts. But one of the things that gets glossed over all the time is that it was Cindy Gladue's boyfriend, this Indigenous man that she was seeing, who introduced her to the man that murdered her. So he was essentially pimping her out. And that's an important part of this discussion. It's an uncomfortable one, but it's really important, because if we don't name the problem and we're not truthful about who's doing what to who, we can't ever solve that issue. We can't ever move forward. And so I propose a sex-based definition of colonization, which would be that colonization is male entitlement and female obligation. So if we look at colonization as a form of as the form of male entitlement and female obligation, we begin to see that prostitution is maybe the most visible form of colonization, in that men feel entitled to women's bodies, and women, on the contrary, feel obligated to provide that, and for any number of reasons, right? Access to what they need to live, maybe because they feel horrible about themselves. Maybe there's so many reasons why women are in prostitution when they actually don't want to be. That's not where they want to be. And we also see that if we think about colonization as male entitlement and female obligation, we see that too when white men came to Canada initially. White women weren't allowed to come. White women were property at that point in time. One could argue still the case. So they had no rights, and were just kind of brought over to Canada when the men decided that it was time to bring them over. And what these white men had done is, in their own countries, they had colonized their own women, and then they decided that they were going to go look for other places, and they're going to sail the ocean blue, and they were going to be explorers and adventurers, whatever, and conquer lands, etc. But there was no women. Women weren't doing that. Women weren't allowed to do that. And so these men who were doing that, they felt entitled. They had enough. They had land. They had food. Like, they had enough. But that wasn't enough for them. They felt entitled to more. And so they went out looking for more. And I think that I do think that patriarchy, so male entitlement, or I guess patriarchy, we could think more of male domination and female subjugation. But if we think about it in that sense, it really does go hand in hand with capitalism. So men need to take away what women need to survive, so that they can then trick women into having to get it back. And so my grandma used to say, like, if you were thirsty, you would go down to the river and drink. If you were hungry, you would go hunt or find food. If you needed a house, you built your house. And that's the kind of world that we were living in. But now, obviously, that's not at all. Like, most First Nations, many First Nations, many people around the world don't have access to clean water. People don't have housing. People don't have enough food to eat. That's all been taken from us, and we've been unable to access it besides going through this capitalist system. And so once you kind of throw capitalism on the fire, on that gasoline onto this fire of male entitlement and female obligation, it just like combusts into something wholly different than what was there before. And so, as I mentioned earlier, and Chris, can you give me a sign when I have maybe about 2 minutes left? Sorry. So one of the things as I was doing this research, so I was like, okay, how do I show, or how is prostitution of Indigenous women a form of colonization? And so then I was like, okay, well, I have to consider maybe we have the definition of colonization wrong, which I think that we do right now. I think that if we look at a female-centered, woman-centered definition of colonization, it allows us to explain things that we couldn't before. And one of those things, I know previous years ago, I used to say, and I've heard many Indigenous women say, that when white men came, that they imposed patriarchy onto Indigenous communities. And I used to say that too, but I would argue today that when white men came, Indigenous men adopted patriarchy, they adopted capitalism. They decided that there was some benefit in it for them, and so they thought it was a good idea. In the same way that we don't say that, businessmen, that we impose capitalism on businessmen, right? They adopt that system because it works for them and there's benefit in it for them. So, so if we look at colonization as primarily sex-based, it very much makes visible the collusion between Indigenous men and non-Indigenous men, which has been going on since the beginning, in different kinds of ways. I would say too that when we look at colonization as primarily sex-based, it really helps us overcome the idea that Indigenous women and girls are somehow totally different from other women and girls. And I think that that's been the dominant analysis up until now, is that, so for example, in the inquiry into murdered and disappeared Indigenous women and girls, there was no feminist text in the literature review. So that was just totally not part of what was going on. And that's because it was seen as not being relevant. And I think that rape is rape is rape. If you're a woman and you've been through that, or you've been afraid of that, or you've seen that happen, that experience is more similar than it is different between us. And I would argue that in the case of Indigenous women and girls, it's not so much different as it is specific, or as it is particular. So there's a particular history there. There's a particular way that it happens. There's, particular ideas and laws and, solutions even to the cases of prostitution and other forms of male violence against Indigenous women and girls, but it's not different. It's just particular. And I think that the more that we separate from each other, the harder it becomes then for us to organize together. But, it becomes harder to find a solution, because suddenly it's as if we're a different species of human almost that needs a totally different solution, when I don't think that's the case at all. And so I think really starting from this sex-based definition of colonization, we can kind of look at it and we can decide, do we support colonization? So do we support the idea that men are entitled to women's bodies, to women's food, to women's ideas, everything? that men are entitled, and that women are obligated to provide that childcare, emotional labor, you know, everything that we are is we're supposed to be giving. We're obligated to give to men in this definition of colonization. And so we either can say, yes, we support that, or no, we don't. And there's no in between. And I think that what we see with prostitution is similar to what we saw with the case of rape in marriage, which was legal in Canada until 1983. And so with rape being legal in marriage, it meant that there was an exception. So we could say, yes, men are not entitled to sexually access women's bodies, except when they're married. And we continue to do that with prostitution, not so much legally with the changes that have been made, but in terms of our kind of public opinion on prostitution, we decide somehow that pornography is okay. So men aren't entitled to access women's bodies sexually unless you're in prostitution, unless you're in pornography, etc. So it really is, there is no fence sitting with this question, even though I think many try to sit on that fence, but it is or it isn't, period. And so I'll talk a little bit about what I saw in New Zealand. And so I was there for a few months. It was so amazing. I remember walking like somewhere in the woods in New Zealand, and there's no bears, like there's no predators. And it's such a weird feeling because you're kind of like looking around, keeping your eyes open for the bears, but there's none. So it was really cool. And also, kiwis are the size of a basketball. I thought they were like little tiny, but they're not. So I learned those things, but I learned other things as well. And probably the two biggest things that I learned about prostitution in New Zealand from being there was the first was how quiet it was. It was like almost silent. It was as if men had completely won. This was absolutely a normal part of everyday life. There was no advertising. Like I didn't see any advertising on buildings, or sometimes you'll see even the papers or whatever, and they'll have you know listings, or you can tell, where it's happening. I didn't find that to be the case at all in New Zealand. It was just like any other business. Like you wouldn't know if it was a laundromat or if it was a place where prostitution was happening on the outside anyways. And so that was so not what I expected. I thought it was going to be this big, I don't know, like when you go to like Las Vegas, or never been there, but something like that, right? Where it's in your face. But I think because it's so normal, it really is just normal. It's just a part of the fabric of life there. So in the same way, it's kind of as if New Zealand was going to say, okay, we're going to criminalize grocery stores, is how they think about prostitution or brothels there. They're like, why would we do that? That's ridiculous. And so that's terrifying in a whole other way. And I think the silence of it is not just in the landscape in terms of not being able to see it for the most part, but it's also in what you're allowed to say. And so in my own experience, when I was there, I decided to do a presentation. And so I went to one of the universities and I rented a room, and I paid the cost of the room. And I was normally what you get a room, and you get like a table and some audio, etc. And the university, you get your event put on the university calendar, but they refused to put the event on the calendar. And the women told me that they would not put an event that was critical of prostitution in their calendars, in the same way that they wouldn't put, for example, a pro-life event in their calendar. So they were just not willing to advertise the event for me, because they didn't like what I was saying. And that led to a whole bunch of difficulties in terms of me trying to figure out where is this, and then the doors were locked, and so there was a lot of things that happened that I was like, this is a lot of things going wrong. I wonder if this is connected to what it is that I'm saying, and they really don't want that to be happening. So, and I met Indigenous women there who were so afraid, I think, and in a lot of places in Canada, it's very similar. But I feel like there, because it's such this like heavy, heavy blanket that women are so scared to speak. And that was one of the things that was very difficult, was actually finding women that I could speak with who were willing to speak with me. Just the level of fear of, losing their jobs, losing their credibility, similar things to what we have here in terms of both prostitution, but also in terms of transgender politics, for example. It was real. And what I saw, and I think this relates, is so you see this really like cohesive place where prostitution really is happening behind closed doors. But I'd see it. So for example, in the hotel I was staying in, I went up the elevator to go to my room, and there was a woman and a man, and you just knew that the woman was there, just that this man had hired her to be there for sex acts. And so we just chatted a little bit in the elevator, but it's just normal. Like that was just how they do things there. But you would also see it in terms of Indigenous women and women of color. You would see those women on the street. Those women were still on the street. And I think that that's very connected to all of the statistics that I mentioned earlier about Indigenous women in Canada generally apply to Indigenous women in New Zealand or Aotearoa as well. And I think generally apply to Indigenous women around the world. So even when there's this false case made that it's safer or better somehow inside, even if that was true, which it's not, Indigenous women aren't the ones. We're still out on the streets. So that's where you saw it. You saw it again, that very visible display, I would argue, of sex-based colonization was very clearly on display in New Zealand. And how much time do I have, Chris?
I thought we could stop now if
I've got one more little point.
Yeah, one more, sure.
One more little point. I'm so sorry. The second and last thing, I'm so sorry, that I saw in New Zealand was the complete lack of understanding of male violence against women and girls, why it happens, how women respond to it. So the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, for example, were telling me it was so great that women often lived in the brothels that they worked in, and when they got kicked out unceremoniously, that sometimes the Johns were so nice and they would let the women stay at their homes, and they thought that this was a really great thing. So zero understanding. They would call incest family violence, or sex trafficking of children was classified as family violence sometimes. So just complete understanding. And the last thing that I'll say is, when the law in New Zealand was being debated, initially there was some submissions made by feminists, and those were completely and absolutely dismissed at the very beginning. They were just like, nope, not applicable in this situation. And so a feminist understanding of prostitution and of male violence was not even considered in the creation of the law at all, because they decided that it just wasn't relevant from the get-go. So thank you.
Thank you. No, I think there'll be a lot more questions about some of the things you went into, Sherry, but that's great to get that foundation and then your experience in New Zealand. Our next guest is JANINE BENEDET, who's a professor of law at the Allard School of Law in UBC. And her research focuses on legal responses to men's violence against women and girls, men's sexual violence against women and girls, and including sexual assault, prostitution, and pornography. And Professor Benedet's a member of the bar in BC. She's appeared in court as intervener counsel in a number of cases, including prostitution and sexual violence against women cases. She's testified regularly before the House of Commons and the Senate committees on laws related to human trafficking and commercial sex trade. And in 2024, she received a Governor General's Medal in commemoration of the Persons Act for her work promoting the equality of women and girls. And Janine is going to talk about Canada's legal landscape, what PCEPA is, I might be saying that wrong, which is the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, what that is, what the laws were like before that, and what happened at the Supreme Court in the 2013 Bedford decision, and how we got to PCEPA, sometimes known as the Nordic model, I guess. So welcome, Janine. Thanks very much for being here, and we'd love to hear from you.
Well, thanks very much, Chris, and I'm delighted to be here and give you just a very brief and high-level overview of sort of where we came from and where we've ended up legally in Canada. And so let me start a little bit in terms of where we were so that you can understand what it was the Bedford case was challenging. So for a number of years in Canada, we had sort of a patchwork of laws that applied to different aspects of the commercial sex trade. And I'll maybe kind of, if I were to sort of pick a snapshot in time of maybe the early 2000s, at that point, what we had was we had a law called the Communication Law, which prohibited communicating in a public place for the purpose of prostitution, so really targeting street prostitution. That was brought in 1985. We had a law called the Body House Law that was focusing on brothels and massage parlors and certain kinds of escort prostitution if you were going back to the same location again and again. And those laws applied to the person running the body house, like the madam. They applied to the women who were selling sexual services. They were called the inmates. And they applied to the guys who were buying, who were called the found-ins. And then we had a sort of third set of laws that targeted pimping, and they were called the Living on the Avails provisions. And so these provisions were put in place for different reasons over different times, but none of them really prohibited the buying or selling of sex directly. We did have a law for a long time in Canada called a vagrancy law, which made it an offense to be a common prostitute. And that was repealed in 1968. At the same time, some homosexuality was decriminalized, some restrictions on abortion were lifted as sort of part of this, second wave sexual revolution kind of movement. The state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation. So some people said that, the collection of these laws meant that prostitution was legal, but just prohibited in certain locations or in certain ways. And I suppose that was one way to look at it, but the other way to look at it is that it was mostly illegal. But when you looked at how the police were enforcing those laws, it was almost exclusively against the sellers. Yes, there were some arrests of Johns, and some communities had John schools where men were then diverted out into these educational sessions. But disproportionately, it was women who were targeted for arrests and convictions. And so that was the landscape that we had in place. And so the Bedford case was a challenge brought by three women with sort of long-standing ties to the commercial sex trade, one of whom had operated a brothel in her own home. She was sort of a self-styled dominatrix, Terry Jean Bedford. Another one, Val Scott, who had started in prostitution and then had sort of become a bit of an advocate for the industry. And these three women all started in the sex trade very young, 15, 16, and 18 years of age by their own admission. All of them had recounted horrible experiences they had had in the sex trade, but nonetheless, they argued that all of these laws that I've just described were unconstitutional, and in particular that they violated the charter rights to liberty and security of the person of women in prostitution. And interestingly, when they started out, their arguments were very much focused on the liberty side of things, and in particular, the argument that they were choosing this line of work, that it ought to be seen as a job, and that laws restricting them from carrying on prostitution in the ways that they wanted to do it, indoors in massage parlors or what have you, meant that their liberty rights were being infringed. But very quickly, their lawyer, Alan Young, figured out that a much more sympathetic argument to the public was to focus on security of the person. We had had the very high-profile Picton case in British Columbia, and we were starting to get some public attention to the incredible risks to safety of women in prostitution, particularly the most marginalized women on the street whose prostitution was the most visible. And so he said, no, let's not talk about liberty. That's going to be a loser argument. Let's talk about security of the person, and let's argue that prohibiting prostitution on the street, it makes it more unsafe because you don't have time to screen your clients, as if somehow by, looking in the car, you can tell that this man is going to kill you or not. And let's say that the laws that prohibit it indoors, these body house laws, make it unsafe because it's actually safer to be indoors than on the street, which of course the Cindy Gladue case would tell you that that's of course a myth. And let's say the living on the avails laws are unconstitutional because, now you can't hire a manager or a driver or a bodyguard who's going to protect you. Now, I represented a coalition of women's groups who intervened in the Bedford case, and part of what we argued is that, we're not stopping to think about the roles of the different parties here and who it is that's actually the source of this danger to women, because the violence that women in the sex trade experience is from the buyers, from the Johns, and from the pimps. And so why on earth would we decriminalize the men who are actually causing the harm in the interests of women's safety? We should be decriminalizing the sellers for sure, who are overwhelmingly, but not exclusively, women. And we should be criminalizing the buyers, who are all men, and the pimps, who are, again, mostly men. And so this is an issue of sex inequality, in addition to, racial inequality and a practice of colonialism, targeting women with disabilities, etc., targeting girls. And we ought to see this as a practice of inequality. And once you recognize it that way, well, of course, you're not going to punish those who are being targeted, whose vulnerabilities are being exploited. You're going to punish the people creating the demand for the industry. The other piece of law that is worth knowing about, of course, which was kind of operating alongside this, is the trafficking laws, which were brought in 2005. And they were kind of an interesting parallel to these other laws because, of course, sex trafficking is a major component of trafficking in persons. And at that time, the industry was very much sort of, trafficking is like a backdoor way to shut down the sex trade. Trafficking doesn't exist. It's a moral panic. It's migration for sex work. So they were very dismissive of the idea that there was actually any trafficking, and very much opposed our argument, which was, look, sex trafficking, which is a practice in which a third party exploits someone's vulnerability or uses coercion or manipulation to get them into the sex trade. We traffic people because there's a market for them, because traffickers make money, and it's the demand that, of course, generates the need to traffic these individuals in order to attain this profit. So ultimately, our arguments at the Supreme Court of Canada were not successful, in the sense that the court did strike down all of those provisions, found them to be unconstitutional. But two good things kind of came out of it, which opened the door to PCEPA. And the first was that the Supreme Court of Canada did recognize in its reasons that most people in prostitution were not there by choice. And that was an important kind of anchor for us, for our arguments going forward, to say these are vulnerable people, And rather than trying to count, whether this person is okay and it's okay to buy her or not or whatever, that we ought to keep our focus on that large majority of people whose vulnerabilities mean really that they're targeted, that prostitution chooses them. And so that was important. And the other thing was that the court did recognize that Johns and pimps were the primary source of the violence to those in prostitution. And so a number of us began to lobby at the parliamentary level for what would replace these provisions that had been struck down. The Supreme Court gave Parliament a year to bring in new laws, and they said that it wouldn't be a good state of affairs to have no laws at all related to the sex trade. And so we began to push for what is sometimes described as the Nordic model or an abolitionist model or the equality model, one that would stop criminalizing those who sell sex, but would directly criminalize those who buy and those who profit. And we were successful largely in getting, just about a year later, a series of amendments to the criminal code in a piece of legislation called the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. And so these new provisions, first of all, for the first time, directly criminalize obtaining sexual services for consideration, something of value. So it criminalizes buying anywhere. It doesn't matter whether you're on the street or indoors or it's an escort or whatever. And it doesn't matter how old the person is you're buying, although the penalties are higher for buying youth. And so those provisions, for the first time, said, look, the demand for prostitution is exploitative, and it's classified as an offense against the person. So it's in the part of the criminal code that deals with assaults, not morality or vice or whatever, but that this is an act of violence. And that was really important. The laws also criminalize obtaining a material benefit from someone else's prostitution. So that's kind of the pimping part, and procuring, like recruiting someone into prostitution, and also advertising someone else's sexual services. And so these provisions all have a clause in them that says that those who sell their own sexual services are immune from prosecution. They can't be prosecuted like as a party to the buyer or something like that. The only exception to that is there is a provision that says that women can be criminalized for selling sex near a school or a daycare, which was something we, objected to, but in any event, I think was there to pander to the base of the governing party at the time. So that's the regime that we have in place now. It's been in place for over 10 years. And the preamble to the law really acknowledges that this is a gendered practice, that it's a practice associated with exploitation, and that targeting the demand is necessary, both to address the fact that that's what creates the market, but also to address the kind of normalization piece that Cherry spoke of. That once you legally say that, at least in some circumstances, it's legal to buy sexual services, you've set a baseline for normalization. And I'll just end by saying that throughout my involvement in the Bedford case, I consistently heard not just men, but women as well, saying to me, but prostitution is legal in Canada. But prostitution has been legalized. And they pointed to the repeal of the vagrancy provision, or they pointed to the fact that outcall escort prostitution didn't really fall into any of these laws. And it was deeply important to them that that was the case, because there is a function that law serves to kind of either denounce behavior as not being okay or to normalize it. And there is a way in which decriminalization legitimizes behavior, whether you engage in it or not, and sets a baseline for what's acceptable in society. So, as we'll see, and Trisha's going to talk about this, just passing criminal laws to prohibit things doesn't make those things go away. Anybody who thinks the criminal law, solves complex social problems doesn't understand what criminal law is for. We've always criminalized murder and we still have it, right? It doesn't do that. Child sexual abuse is criminalized, but unfortunately it continues to be a serious problem. But the most important function of the criminal law is to say this behavior is not acceptable, and it's the responsibility of the state, not of individual private women, to respond to it, right? And to say that this is inappropriate and not what we're about as a society. So we were very pleased to get that legislation through and to succeed through a lot of hard work, including by Cherry and Trisha and many, many others, to get those provisions in place. But so the story does not end there, so I'll turn it over to Trisha, who's going to tell you some more, or back to Chris, I guess, before we hear from Trisha.
Thanks, Janine. That was really helpful too. Together you're all painting a picture, I think, for some of the people attending, that's sort of just making a whole story, and this is really, really super helpful. Now our third guest, and actually the person behind getting this group of incredible women together and formulating this day, and this day is hopefully part one of part two, because it's such a huge issue that we need to revisit it in the fall, we thought about. But our third guest is TRISHA Baptie, a survivor of prostitution from the ages of 13 to 28. TRISHA's changing the conversation surrounding the sex industry by directly challenging the demand for paid sex, as well as addressing the intersecting and systemic issues that drive women and girls' vulnerability to be trafficked into prostitution and the sex industry as a whole. So in 2008, she founded EVE, formerly Exploited Voices Now Educating, a group that gives survivors a voice to help create societal, legal, and policy change. Trisha's recognized nationally and internationally. Her work includes a TEDx talk, participation in the NFB documentary Buying Sex. She was part of the process when Canada succeeded in gaining its new prostitution laws that Janine just talked about. Trisha's sought after writer and presenter and expert on these issues. And Trisha's going to talk about some of the legal challenges to PCEPA, including the decision, I think, from Judge Goldstein in 2023 and the conviction of Mikhail Klubakov. She'll discuss the lack of enforcement of our laws, especially here in Vancouver. And also, we talked about this as we were getting ready today, the misinformation and the ignorance around what the truth is, what the laws are, and what's been done. And we've seen a lot of that in the media lately. And Trisha's going to talk about that a bit too. So over to you, Trisha.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. And thanks to Women's Space for having this event being put on. I'm going to start by reading the preamble for PCEPA so that we're all kind of on the same page. And also because I've been, called a dreamer, but I find it personally very encouraging because it's very clear in the purpose that it has for the laws that we have. So it's pretty short, but it says, whereas the Parliament of Canada has grave concerns about the exploitation that is inherent in prostitution and the risks of violence posed to those who engage in it. Whereas the Parliament of Canada recognizes the social harm caused by the objectification of the human body and the commodification of sexual activity. Whereas it is important to protect human dignity and the equality of all Canadians by discouraging prostitution, which has a disproportionate impact on women and children. Whereas it is important to denounce and prohibit the purchase of sexual services because it creates a demand for prostitution. Whereas it is important to continue to denounce and prohibit the procurement of persons for the purpose of prostitution and the development of economic interests in the exploitation of the prostitution of others, as well as the commercialization and institutionalization of prostitution. Whereas the Parliament of Canada wishes to encourage those who engage in prostitution to report incidents of violence and to leave prostitution, And whereas the Parliament of Canada is committed to protecting communities from the harms associated with prostitution. Now, therefore, Her Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate and the House of Commons of Canada, enacts the following: the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, which may be cited as PCEPA. So that's what we're working with today, which, after reading that, baffles me how anyone can say that prostitution is legal in Canada and that it's this benign interaction between two people behind closed doors that we have no kind of right to have a say in. I think it's completely misinformation, but I'll go into that in a minute. So since we've had PCEPA on the books, we've had 2 cases, charter challenges. Glad Janine's here so she can correct me if I get any of the terminology wrong. I'm gonna try. So the first one was in 2019. 2 men, Kubikoff and Mustaine, were charged with 2 offenses under PCEPA. They were drivers for an escort agency, the owners of which were charged and convicted of human trafficking. In fact, 5 men were charged with trafficking offenses and prostitution-related offenses. Kubikoff and Mustaine were charged with material benefiting and procuring offenses. And their lawyers fought to have that conviction overturned, and because they challenged the constitutionality of the legislation. And those charges were initially overturned. However, the charges were reinstated after Crown took to the case to Alberta's Court of Appeal. And I believe it's at this point that the group I have, Eve, joined with other women's groups across Canada to form the Women's Equality Coalition, which Janine so graciously represented us in. And we were able to take our arguments to the Alberta's Court of Appeal, and those charges were reinstated, and they're still in jail to this day, because the Court of Appeal found that the offenses did not prohibit sex workers from taking safety measures, and therefore did not infringe and that part of the charter or part of the charter. The other case was in 2021. The Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform, which is a group of, those involved in sex work, launched an Ontario Supreme Court challenge or appeal on PCEPA. They argued that the laws endangered sex workers by forcing them to operate in the shadows and prevented them from hiring security. Just want to point out here, I was involved in prostitution for 15 years. Don't know a lot of people who employed security. We didn't really have the money to pay this plethora of people to help keep us safe. So that went before the court in 2021. And in September of 2023, Judge Goldstein, who was the judge on the case, his decisions found that all the provisions of Canada's prostitution laws were in fact constitutional, and gave us very sound fact-based decision. And he gave us a very sound fact-based decision that's pretty hard to argue with. He noted that Parliament's view of the harms of the sex trade is grounded in real evidence. He observed that significant numbers of sex workers come from marginalized and racialized groups, particularly Indigenous women and girls. He also pointed to evidence that sex work is highly gendered, with the overwhelming majority of sex workers being females and the customers being male. He also found there's a very strong link between sex work and trafficking, and that violence and the threat of violence present in the everyday lives of many sex workers. So, and we're trying to figure out if it was really filed or not, but I heard on Friday that the Goldstein decision has been officially appealed as well, and would be heard in spring of 2027. So I'll get back to you on that if I'm totally wrong, but that's what I've heard. I think in both of these cases that upheld the law, it just proves that when you look at this through a feminist lens, through a harm lens, and through a lens that is honest, I think it really shows that prostitution is not this benign, I'll use that word again, interaction between two people. And I think we also need to really have a conversation, honestly, about the amount of misinformation that's in the media right now. I don't know about anyone else, but I'm about done with CBC. And I'm about done with all this conversation happening in the media that doesn't challenge the idea of men having the right to procure their orgasm on their terms at all times, right? There's no conversation around the inherent harms in prostitution. And I think, you know, running an organization like Eve, no one's talking about what women who are leaving prostitution leave with. They're not leaving with millions of dollars. They're not leaving with RRSPs. They're not leaving with, you know, funds for retirement. They're leaving with PTSD. They're leaving with scars from violence. They're leaving with scars that they inflicted upon themselves because they can't stand the situations that they find themselves in. They're leaving with serious mental health issues because of the amount of dissociation that has to happen when you're involved in prostitution. Those are the things that women and girls are leaving prostitution with. And if we look at the conversation that's happening in the media right now, there's no real acknowledgement of that. And if there is, it's as if it's just a side issue at best. That the real issue is just there are apparently all these thousands of women across Canada who want to sexually serve men on their terms at all times and are perfectly happy to do that. And that's just not the case. Here in Vancouver, I think we have a very particular problem because VPD has, I think this is my personal opinion, I think VPD has long wanted to be seen as like the trailblazers, not only in dealing with prostitution, but also, you know, marijuana, illegal substances. Like they want to be seen as this like alternative to just enforcing laws and want to be seen as compassionate and want to be seen as, you know, all these kind of alternate ways of dealing with crime other than actually enforcing the law. And I think part of that comes out of the societal guilt that we had post-Picton, when I was part of the women that would go to police and say, you know, like, you need to look into whoever. She's gone missing. We haven't seen her in a really long time. And the police would look at us and say, yeah, but you're hookers. We're not really going to put the time or effort into it. They just went somewhere else. They just don't want to talk to you anymore, right? So I think between the societal guilt of having Picton happen with the RCM or VPD want to be seen as these progressive kind of police officers, there was this real buy-in to the idea that sex work is work and that women were perfectly okay with doing this and that they should be protected to engage in this really dangerous activity. There was no conversation really about how inherently violent prostitution is. We talk about the big crimes like Picton. There was another guy out in Richmond, I can't remember his name, who preyed on like Indigenous youth in care. Barton, like, there's these very big cases of violence, but there's no real talk of the minutia of the violence and how as a former prostitute, I remember if a man went to get his wallet too quickly or if he moved too quickly, you're like, oh, like, you're just always on guard and living in this place of like continual fear and continual scoping out of situations. And there's no place in the discussion right now to have these really nuanced conversations. And I'm not here to argue about whether or not women want to be in prostitution. I'm here to talk about why we think men should be able to purchase sex. How does men purchasing sex help create an egalitarian society? You know, Canada really wants to pride itself on being this like gender equal country, and we've made all these strides and women have all these rights. If we have all these rights, why is it so easy to deny us our basic ones and put us in a place where we find ourselves having to sell ourselves to fill those basic rights? I think that's pretty problematic. And there's this conversation that, you know, prostitution is legal. And I think by reading the preamble of the law, we can see that that's not the case at all. And I'll end with saying, I think we need to be constantly making sure we label the problems within prostitution correctly, right? It wasn't the laws that beat and raped and killed me and my friends. It was men. And it wasn't the location we were in that was unsafe. So it didn't matter if we were in the streets, if we were in a hotel, if we were in a body house, if we were, you know, at our friend's apartment, in our apartment. It wasn't the place that was unsafe. It was the man we were in that place with that made it unsafe. And that's what we need to be constantly remembering. And so we need our news to change the conversation. And I know right now it may feel like we're fighting a losing battle because, I mean, in all honesty, in some ways, we kind of are at editorial levels. Some decisions have been made that they just aren't going to post from our perspective, right? And that's why I think it's really crucial, not only for organizations, for nonprofits, for feminist groups, for women's groups, to be writing in to CBC, Global, wherever, as individuals who are saying, you know what, I'm not okay with this, and here are my reasons why. Because I think they're used to really hearing it from groups, from organizations, but it's the people, individual people, who will take the time to write in. You may not get a response, you may not hear anything back, but they have to read those, right? And they, just like we really had to work together to get PCEPA put in. I mean, we worked with organizations that made for very strange bedfellows, like just very strange bedfellows, right? And we kind of need that momentum again to partner with people, organizations, nonprofits, whoever they are, that normally we might not, but do agree on this one issue. So I think, yeah, it can feel a little overwhelming and infuriating for me personally when I read about it in the news. But we don't need to let that paralyze us into inaction. We should actually be letting that encourage us into doing something about it. So I'll end there.
Wow, thank you. I mean, all of you together is a powerhouse here of information and passion. And we have so many questions that were sent in advance, but I know there's going to be questions, and we have only about 25 minutes. But there's going to be questions that arose from your talks as well. So we'll get to as many as we can. We won't be able to get to all of them, but the Q&A is getting opened if people want to put in some questions. I'm going to ask a couple of things that came up prior. Some of the preamble questions were, some of the questions that were sent ahead of time have already been answered by your presentations, so that's great. There's a couple that are sort of in a particular direction that you sort of addressed a bit, Trisha, but people want to learn more about how to support this issue, this struggle, how to support the women who are suffering, and how to sort of respond to this issue. And you talked about writing letters to media, I imagine to politicians, to other people, but what other ways can people, just individuals, because I think that is really true, that it's not just organizations, but individual feedback is important. How can individuals help or hinder? How can help the well-being of women in this country to move towards keeping this law and improving things? And
I think part of it is having conversations with your immediate circles. This isn't the most fun dinner time conversation or dinner party conversation, but it's a conversation that needs to be had, right? You need to be having it, because even if you don't know a woman who's being personally prostituted, you know a man who's paying for that prostituted person.
Right.
Whether it's your brother, your uncle, your dad, your grandfather, your best friend's husband, like everyone knows someone who's paying for sex, right? There was a statistic when we fought for PCEPA. I believe the statistic said 1 in 6 men pay for sex.
Wow.
And that stat was out of Sweden. And so if you know 7 men, one of them's paying for sex, right? Like statistically that it's there. Right. And so I think it's really important to share what you know in dinner conversations, at whatever social functions you find yourself at, where you're making small talk and, oh, what'd you read in the news kind of thing. I think it's really important to be that voice of dissension that's like, yeah, you know what? I don't actually think that it's being portrayed correctly or fairly or honestly or, with integrity, because this is what the preamble actually says. This is what the laws were intended to do. And it's not about making prostituted women fight for their rights.
Mhm.
Prostituted women have the same rights that any other woman has.
Right.
The burden they're carrying is and the vernacular of sex work hides the male equation of the entire thing. So whether it's the purchasing of sex, whether it's pimping, sex trafficking, whatever, advertising, running the common body house, running the massage parlor, whatever it is, by and large, we do see some women in those spots, but by and large, it's still men, right? And if we're not having these conversations that include the male portion of the equation, we're not doing the subject justice.
Right.
We need to keep, it's kind of a bit like steering the Titanic, but
Right.
it can be done.
Yeah.
But we need to be including the men in these conversations and their behaviors.
Absolutely. Yeah, Sherry and I have talked before about being party poopers, because we'll bring up things that other people kind of go, ooh.
Oh,
And,
yeah, I'm not my party dinner invitations have dropped quite significantly.
That's right. That's right. Well, I loved how you reframed it, and you all have done that how you've just reframed it for things. And I feel like I already knew some things, and I already had a perspective, and I've learned so much, and just your reframing. And so for me to learn from you, how can I reframe it? I need to reframe it so that other people think about it differently, because that's such a huge part of it is putting it into the perspectives that you've all talked about. I'm looking for the Q&A function here and to see if anybody's typing in questions right now. So I'm going to see.
While you're doing that, I might just say, the industry and its supporters really want you to be on the defensive. They want to say, like, your women are in danger, and you're pushing women into dark court, whatever. And so the whole narrative is about you having to defend why you think, that the criminal law should come in and make marginalized women less safe. And so it's really important to reclaim the high ground, and that kind of flipping you've heard from Cherry and from Trisha about, why should men have the right to do this? And what does it mean that they think that they do? And what does that mean for the equality of all women? And how on earth does that make marginalized women safer? And do you really think Indigenous women just choose it 10 times more than other women? Like, we need to be firm in pushing back. And letters to the editor and responses to media, huge if women can do that.
Yeah.
To say, CBC, CTV, whatever, Globe and Mail, why aren't you featuring any of the many organizations that work to end the prostitution of women and hold men to account? Why are you normalizing and not questioning men's sex purchase? I woke up this morning to CBC Radio talking about women in Montreal, sex workers on strike during Formula One, calling for the decriminalization of sex work and no bar fees, and they want to be, employees, not independent contractors in the strip clubs. And then a mention about, and they point out that many of the women working in these bars are vulnerable, but not a word about the men who are coming to F1 to buy them and what ought to happen to them.
Right. Well, here's a question. What are, if any, men doing to organize, educate, retrain men? And I know, Trisha, you and I have talked about that a little bit, but let's talk about the entitled men that we're talking about in this conversation.
Sorry, what's the question?
We've talked a bit about men educating, training,
other men.
Other men. What's happening in that department?
I really only know of two groups here in Canada. One's called Empower Men, and it's out of Winnipeg. It's affiliated with Mumway Center, and it's okay, no, I know more than two groups. Sorry, that's a lot. So they go into schools and talk about exploitation and how they can help stop it, but by not participating in it in the first place, right? There's empowerment, there's exploitation, education, Moose Hide campaign. Those are kind of the three that stand out for me, that do try and tackle demand at kind of the root and get men when they're young enough to hopefully be able to change behaviors before they've started, right? But I mean, there's also what's Gail Dines' organization called? Culture Reframed. And she's one of the best ones, I think, that is dealing with youth, because she's also dealing with pornography. Prostitution and pornography are the same beast. It's just one's on camera and one isn't. And we know that young boys are seeing, pornography for the first time by the time they're 8 or 9, right? On the school grounds, because someone's got a little laptop in their pocket called an iPhone, right? And so I think, particularly for parents, you need to be having these conversations with your kids at an uncomfortably young age, because if you're not, then porn is. And I have 3 boys. I don't want to talk to them about that. And this is my job, right? And I don't want to talk to my kids. We have to be having these really uncomfortable conversations. Otherwise, it gets so normalized in day-to-day society, right? Between viewing pornography underage, between even some of the what are they called? Reality TV shows that are on right now. There was one called The Bunny Ranch to look at the most famous brothel in Nevada. If we want to change the perspective of men, we need to get them as boys.
Right. Well, and that's, now that the Q&A has got some questions, that actually is the first question is, what's a way to reach men and boys? And what did you say was Gail Dines' organization, or something?
It's called Culture Reframed.
Okay, so people that want to learn more about how to reach men and boys in their lives or in their communities, then that might be a place to go. Someone else talked about We Are the Lions. Do you know anything about that? Have you heard that?
Oh, that's I think it's affiliated with the BC Lions.
Oh, right.
I think that's domestic violence, though. I don't know if the Lions would go so far as to say prostitution and pornography.
Sports team, yeah. And someone's asking any thoughts on pushing back government funding for pro-prostitution groups. Has anybody, I guess I'm assuming people writing letters would be a good way to government to complain about where money is going and where money isn't going. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think we have to be careful on this one, though, because organizations like Wish, like PACE, their politics and their, analysis is very skewed and it's wrong. However, they are the ones doing the frontline work, right? And we do need emergency beds. We do need emergency counseling. We do need, food every day. So the services they offer are really good, but
Right.
it's the ideology and their politics that are the problem. And we need to somehow find a way to be able to say to governments and their funders,
Mhm.
like, what they do is good,
Mhm.
like, or not good, but needed, unfortunately. But everything else, they're falsely using the data they collect on the women who come to their
Right.
centers. I know women who have gone to PACE, and they're never asked, do you think men should be able to buy sex? They're never asked, like, the
Right.
questions that we're posing in this panel right here, right?
Right.
They're asked, do you want to be safe? Who's going to say no to that?
Right.
They're asked, do you want, do you want counseling on demand? Who's going to say no to that? Like, they're not, the framing of the questions is the problem.
Right.
And so we need to get that through the government and their supporters.
Right. It's more neutral questions. Right. There's a question in the chat now for Cherry, if you are aware of any Indigenous leaders educating boys and men regarding sexual exploitation of Indigenous girls and women.
None that I know of. I mean, I didn't know about the Moonshine campaign, that they had a dance on that. I think what's the word? Bitter. Maybe bitter is not the right word. But really, it's very difficult. And it's very, very difficult to bring this up to male leadership in terms of, like, band councils, chief and band councils, and the big Native organizations. I find in kind of like everyday living, I think you're more likely to find Indigenous women saying, like, this is awful. We don't want this. Who, and that's partly because I think prostitution is a lot closer. So it's yourself, or it's your mom, or it's your sisters, or your cousins. Like, you've either done it yourself, or you see the devastation of it. So it's harder to say, oh, well, it just impacts, that group over there. So I think on kind of like a everyday basis, for the most part, Indigenous women are just like, yeah, no, this is terrible. Like, we don't want this for ourselves, and we don't want it for our kids. But in terms of yeah, no, male leadership, I think it's very difficult. And I think that's also very related to prostitution, or sorry, to pornography, what Trisha was saying. Because I mean, not that I've been to very many marches or things like that as of late, but when I have been to those things, I'm like, I wonder how many men here are going to go home and watch porn, when they're done with their reconciliation, whatever it is, their sovereignty, land back, etc., right? So I think too often women's issues are pushed to the side, and it's about sovereignty, it's about land. Let's do that, and then we'll deal with the women's question after. Like, we're seen as unimportant and just an add-on, maybe, once the real issues are addressed. So that's been my experience, unfortunately.
Right.
Cherry, do you think that there's been some maybe useful entry points around, and of course this is not looking at the behavior of Indigenous men, but in terms of coalitions trying to oppose, like, man camps and resource development that in certain areas? I know Justice for Girls, which is not exclusively an Indigenous organization, but has been quite involved in trying to speak out against the establishment of these work camps for various resource extraction projects, which concentrate large numbers of men, often in areas close to Indigenous communities. And then, of course, there's huge demand for prostitution. I just wonder if that might be a useful sort of focal point, almost kind of as an entry point, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure, and I know of other women's groups that are making that, especially women in the North who are making that argument that this is so, so dangerous to have all these men who have no supervision, no family accountability or community accountability, and you're paying them tons of money, and they're just, and I lived up north very briefly, and just the stories that I was hearing of like what happens is like it's almost unbelievable. And so I think could be an entry point for sure, but I do see at the same, yeah, it's a tough one, because I think oftentimes in those discussions, we're still not holding men accountable. We're saying women are vulnerable, which they are, and this is why, but we're missing that piece about who they're vulnerable to and who's exploiting the vulnerability, which is the men. And so I kind of feel like too often we miss that piece a little bit. But it is definitely, I think, for sure, could be a good entry point for sure to start talking about the issues.
I do enjoy when I hear women up north calling them man camps rather than work camps.
Yeah.
Because at least in that case, they're naming who's there. There may be a couple of women working there, but they're man camps, and so they're calling that the danger, and so it's a little bit of a. But I know what you mean. It's always any victims of anything are always named before perpetrators of everything are named, and we've got just a few more minutes, and just a couple of quick ones here. Maybe they're quick, and then I'll ask for any final thoughts from you. But somebody was asking, and you talked about this a bit, Trisha, the challenges to the law. How does anybody want to talk about the risk to potentially this law being struck down? And you mentioned there was something maybe Friday, but what's at level of risk, anything like that? People want to know how secure that people should feel about.
I think Janine would be able to speak best on that.
Yeah, so I'll just say that the Klubikov case that Trisha mentioned, I mean, it went to the Alberta Court of Appeal, but it did go to the Supreme Court of Canada as well. And so we do have now a decision from the Supreme Court of Canada upholding the procuring and material benefit offenses. And the court took a pretty, they were unanimous, and they took a pretty positive line in terms of what these provisions were for, what the risk was, and that Parliament was entitled to pass laws like this. Unfortunately, there were two arguments that the other side made that the Supreme Court of Canada said, well, we'll leave for another day. And these are the ones that are likely to be raised in this other case, this Canadian Alliance case that was kind of put on hold while Klubikov went up in Ontario. And those arguments, both of which I find astonishing, are first of all, the claimants in the Klubikov case said, well, I know that in Bedford we said that we wanted to be able to directly hire security guards, and we wanted to be able to run cooperatives and charitable brothels. But if we look at it now, that's not realistic. The only way you can really hire a manager or have security is through a commercial operation. And so there's a constitutional right to run a commercial brothel, which the law specifically says you can't do. And the court said, well, we don't have enough evidence on that. We'll leave that for another day. The other issue, which is even more fundamental and more troubling, was that they went back to the liberty argument that they kind of abandoned in Bedford. And they said, well, this is actually a core expression of women's bodily autonomy. It's just like abortion. Women should be able to do with their bodies what they want. And if that includes as adults selling, sexual access to their bodies, they have a constitutional right to do that. If that argument succeeds, it really undermines the whole premise of everything, right? And the purchasing law becomes at risk. And it was deeply disturbing to me in Klubikov that LEAF, a national women's, group supposedly committed to women's equality, endorsed that argument. So we have opponents within the feminist movement who want to say this is just like abortion, ignoring all of the very clear reasons why it's not. And the perpetrator, of course, is made invisible and gets to ride the coattails of these women supposedly expressing themselves. So those are the arguments we're going to have to meet. We're gearing up to meet as this appeal. It will go forward, whatever the date is of this Canadian Alliance decision in Ontario. And we do need your support. I mean, I work for free, but it's not free to do it. There are various fees associated with this litigation. And so the groups that bring it forward really, really would benefit from any support that people can give, or just support talking about it and saying that you endorse the positions we're taking.
And how would individuals or groups support you if it was a financial donation or getting information to share, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, not supporting me. As I said, I work for bono, and that's great. But the organizations like EVE, like Vancouver Rape Relief, like the Aboriginal Women's Action Network, who are appearing as part of this coalition, right? There are ways to support them and to say, I want to help defray the costs of this litigation, because we need to have a voice in court.
Okay. So EVE is EVE, and that's organization Trisha's involved with or started. And the other ones you mentioned were Aboriginal Action Network,
A1, Aboriginal Women's Action Network, and Vancouver Rape Relief are all organizations that are,
So people can go to those websites.
And find out more about those organizations and support them.
And I have a question, Sherry. You mentioned at the end of your presentation that you were trying to make a presentation in New Zealand at a university that you weren't getting a lot of support for. And I just wanted to follow up and ask if you did that presentation and if people came and just what happened there.
Yeah, I did. So the woman that told me the reason why the university wasn't advertising, which was supposed to be included in the fee that I paid. So she told me informally that it was because I was critical of prostitution. But I went ahead anyways, and it was a disaster, actually, because I didn't know what to put on the flyer. So I got things a little bit confused. So it made it hard to find the location. And then they had locked the doors to the building, so people weren't able to actually get in. So they had to go around to some other entrance. And then when I went to the room to get it set up, there was like tables and chairs and like food and plates and stuff like all left just in the room. So we had to clear it all out ourselves and try and get set up. So it was a calamity. It was not good. We did it, but I think there was a lot of missed opportunity there. And I don't know how many people showed up and weren't able to find it or weren't able to get into the building. So I did ask for a refund, but they didn't give it to me because they're like, we need this number. And I'm like, Canada doesn't do this number. And they're like, but we need it. So anyways, I was like, fine.
Right.
That's fine.
Well, and if other people want more information about the work that you do and that you've done in your PhD, which was the book that you wrote, and want to get access to that book, they can go to your website, right?
Yeah. I have some links there on my website, cherrysmiley.com.
Yeah.
So,
okay. Great. Yeah. I got the book. I encourage everybody to also get the book and read it. Are there any final thoughts from any of you before we thank you for this time? And we've gone a little bit over, but we want you to go on and have the rest of your day. So any final thoughts from any of you before we close?
Thanks for listening. Thanks for having us.
It's been incredible. I was looking forward to it, and it's more than I even imagined. So I just want to thank you all for all the work you've done in the past, for agreeing to come and talk to us, Women's Space Vancouver, and everyone that's attended, and to share all your experience and expertise and knowledge, and reframing things that makes it easier for us to be party poopers and talk about this where we can, or share information and links and all that kind of thing. This webinar will be posted online, so those that couldn't make it, people can share it after the fact. That'll take a little bit of time, but it will be on the Women's Space. There'll be a link on Women's Space Vancouver for this webinar. Thank you, Janine. Thank you, Cherry. Thank you, Trisha. And like I say, we're hoping for a part 2 to continue this conversation into other areas. So thanks to Trisha for putting this group together, and everybody for attending. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.